Welcome to today's Wisdom Lab. Wisdom isn't just how we think about things, but it's how we live. And I think in today's topic, as Charlie's going to share about money, this is where we will feel the tension of that, the tension of wise living. So let's be ready to be challenged.
And today I'll be talking on the topic of money is the root of all evil, the Bible, free market capitalism, and Christian mission. I would like to begin with two sayings about money that are relatively popular. The first one is money makes the world go round. We use that saying to indicate the fact that money has incredible power. It is as powerful, or at least it feels to us as human beings, as almost as powerful as the laws of nature. The second saying, the title of our talk, is money is the root of all evil. And in a somewhat extreme way, it recognizes the fact that money does not just have power, but they possess dangerous power, a power to be reckoned with which can wreak damage. And for us as Christians, both of these are extremely important to consider because Christian life and Christian discipleship are well-nigh impossible without a good theology of money, without considering both the power that money has over our lives and the inherent dangers that money brings. The problem is that when we turn to the Bible and look for guidance on the topic of money, we are faced with a bewildering variety of perspectives. The Bible does not seem to have one singular take on the topic of money. There are some traditions that are extremely positive about money. You have figures like the Old Testament patriarchs, Abraham and his descendants, who were very rich because they were blessed by God. You have the law of Moses, where Israel's prosperity and blessing is linked to their faithfulness to the Lord. And you have even in books like Job that explore the topic of money and faith in God in a much more nuanced way. You have that positive attitude towards wealth because at the end of the day, when Job demonstrates beyond any doubt that his righteousness, his faith in God is not motivated by simply desire to get rich, he is still restored by God and blessed with a lot of possessions. And then even when we look towards the end of time, the prophetic vision of new creation, it is a vision of plenty, of prosperity, of wealth. So there are a lot of biblical traditions that are very positive about money and wealth. But on the other hand, there are equally significant number of texts that seem to be very suspicious. We may begin with Jesus himself, who was born poor in the corners of the Roman Empire, at the very periphery of the empire. And a lot of his teaching is not very positive about money. So when, for example, the rich young ruler comes to him and asks him, what do I need to do to inherit eternal life? Jesus says, well, it's very easy. Just give all your possessions to the poor and come and follow me. You have texts like the Lucan version of the Beatitudes in Luke chapter 6, where Jesus says, blessed are the poor, because theirs is the kingdom of God. Woe to you who are rich. So the poor and the rich are opposed to one another, and God is quite decidedly in favor of the poor. You have texts like the Epistle of James that is very, very skeptical about the rich. The rich are the oppressors, those who persecute Christians. And even in a passage in 1 Timothy, where we have a more nuanced version of our title, you have the following statement in 1 Timothy chapter 6. But if we have food and clothing, we will be content with these. But those who want to be rich fall into temptations and are trapped by many senseless and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. And you have the more nuanced version of that popular saying. And in their eagerness to be rich, some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pains. So the Bible has both a positive and a negative attitude towards money. And this is part of our problem. And Christians throughout the centuries, trying to construct biblical theology of money, have opted for various ways of reconciling those tensions. There have been important movements in the history of the church where the stress has been on poverty as true expression of Christian spirituality. And I would guess for many of us living in the West, there is the other danger or the other extreme to stress the fact that money is something good. And often when people preach from these difficult New Testament passages, our first instinct is to try to blunt their force. When the New Testament writers talk about the fact that the rich are to be pitied and need to wail and weep because God is on the side of the poor, our instinct quite often is to say, well, of course, money itself is not bad. It is really the attitude we have towards money. So it's okay to be rich. It's just you have to be rich in the right way. And whilst this is theoretically true, in actual fact what it achieves is that it tends to blunt the force of these very, very strong statements about wealth and poverty. What I propose to do is, rather than try to come up with one particular theology of money that will be valid for all times and all circumstances, I want to ask the more narrow question of what should our emphasis and focus be today. And by today, I mean for us living in the West in the first quarter of the 21st century. Because I suspect that the very fact that biblical teaching on money is so complex is because it is a complex problem, and in various situations and circumstances, people need to pay attention to different aspects of the biblical teaching. There are different emphases that come to the fore. So what are the emphases? What are the things we need to be focusing when we search the scriptures and try and construct a theology of money? I think to do that, we need to consider the situation within which we are placed. And of course, I don't have time to analyze fully that situation. So I want to focus on just one aspect of it, which is the ubiquitous presence of the free market in our thinking, society, and culture. We live in a time in human history when the free market has won, if you like, in the sense that everyone thinks that the free market is, or at least a vast majority of people think that the free market is something very important. It is almost the natural state of things, if you like, because it generates wealth and prosperity. And therefore, it has to be protected by all means. And the free market is a place where businesses and autonomous free individuals compete with one another to offer their products, to buy and to sell, to make economic choices. And it is in that free competition between autonomous individuals that wealth is generated. Now, I'm not an economist, so I don't want to evaluate that sort of thinking. What I'm more interested in are the theological implications of that prevalent idea. And part of the problem with our society and our fixation on the free market is the fact that the free market has expanded its influence beyond the sphere of economics. So much so that it has permeated our culture and it seems to define all areas of life. So, for example, we define freedom quite often much more narrowly to the freedom to basically to be able to buy and to sell, to be able to produce and to consume. We focus on effectiveness and competitiveness as some of the key virtues of our society. And the way the free market operates impacts and changes all kinds of areas of life. Take, for example, the sector of higher education. Universities in our day and age have become giant businesses. They, of course, need money to run, to pay their staff and to function. And so they have turned into profit-making businesses where business considerations sometimes override what you might think would be considerations coming from pedagogical concerns. And students turn from learners or disciples into customers. So your aim is no longer simply to teach someone, but to satisfy a customer. And there are many other examples where the free market impacts and changes the way we think and we function. Another important feature of that in our culture is the so-called commodification of life, in which everything becomes a commodity. Because the free market is the place where value is determined. Foucault makes a very interesting point when he says that with the advance of liberalism and capitalism in the 18th century, the market changed its function from a place of justice to a place of truth. And what he means by that is that before the advance of liberalism, the market was a place where the just price was determined. So if you are a craftsman, for example, and you're part of a guild, the guild will determine the price of your product, making sure that it was of a certain quality and the price was fair both to you as the producer and to the customer who could afford it. So it was a place of justice. But with the advance of liberal thinking, the market became a place of truth. It became the place where the true value of things was determined. So how much does a vase, for example, cost? It doesn't matter how much you spend to produce it. The only thing that matters is what is the supply and demand. How much are you willing to sell it for, and how much other people are willing to pay for it. So the market becomes a place that determines value. And this may be okay so long as it applies to purely economic realities, but as the market expands its sphere of influence and engulfs the rest of culture, we begin to think of all areas of life in similar ways. A lot of things become commodities that can be quantified and measured and valued. Things like human life, our time, relationships, and so on. And this is the situation that we live in. And as Christians, we are not immune to it. We are children of our time. And therefore, whether we like it or not, our thinking is influenced by the culture in which we are brought up. There are many examples of this. For example, just consider the way that we talk about mission. We very often talk about investing our time, our energies into the kingdom of God. We talk about discipleship sometimes as a way of accumulating spiritual capital. We talk about the resources that God has given us to further his kingdom. And this sort of language seems natural, partly because the Bible also uses economic metaphors to describe spiritual truths. A lot of Jesus' parables use that kind of language. You only need to think, for example, of the parable of the talents. There is the king, he has his 3 servants, he gives them talents and he goes away. And when he comes back, he expects those talents to be multiplied. And those who bring him more money are rewarded. And those who bring him the same amount of money, not even less, but the same amount of money, are punished. So the king in Jesus' parable is, if you like, the capitalist par excellence. He wants to accumulate his wealth through investment in economic activity, and that is used as an example or as a symbol of spiritual truths and realities. So our language, in a way, feels biblical because the Bible also uses those sorts of images. But we need to consider the fact that we use the same language in 2 very different contexts. In the time of Jesus, economic activity was not conducted in the same way as it is done today. The free market was not there. And the free market has changed our concept of things. So we use the same images, but in a completely different conceptual framework. It's almost like a box of chocolates where the picture on the cover is the same, but all the chocolates inside have been changed. So even though we may use some of the biblical language, the concepts behind that use have shifted. And our thinking also impacts our practice. We need to consider that as well. And let me just take one example, and that is the way we fund and conduct mission. Missions in the modern world sometimes almost feel like international corporations, where various people invest various things for a certain type of spiritual return. So I have the missionary who invests their life and their time and their energy, and you have the individual giver or the church who invests their money, and together these two investors create a global business, if you like, for your customers, who are the people to be reached with the gospel. And if you are thinking within that paradigm, then you quite often might be tempted to resort to all the good marketing practices that are coming to you from TV and the internet anyway, about how to make your product more attractive, more appealing to people. So you begin to market Jesus and the gospel in ways that are acceptable to that particular culture. And in the process of doing that, you reduce depth and spiritual truth to several easily recitable and repeatable truths that can be packaged in ways that are that can be mass-produced and distributed. So our way of thinking about economic activity influences not just our thinking, but our Christian practice. And much like international corporations who move their investment around the globe, depending on the local conditions, so can Christian missions. If you give to this particular mission, but if, for example, the times change and there is something which is more interesting, you can easily move your investment somewhere else where you feel you will get more results. And that also fuels a demand for certain kind of results. When you invest in a business, what you expect is some sort of profit. And the same kind of thinking is sometimes used by people who are engaged in mission. So if I give you an X amount of money, I would like to know what sort of effect those money achieve. What is the return? And that leads to all kinds of corrupt practices that I have observed, at least in certain parts of the world, firsthand. For example, counting converts. If you fund a great mission event somewhere on the other side of the world, you have no way of participating in that personally, but you can look at the videos and read the prayer letters. And most importantly, you can look at the numbers, you can look at the statistics, how many people gave their life to Christ, how many people answered the altar call, and so on. These are tangible ways in which you can measure the effectiveness of your investment. And that leads to a lot of unethical practices, from reporting false numbers to trying to massage figures in a way that they look more appealing, and so on. And it also leads to the stress on the spectacular, because, let's face it, spectacular things are what makes for good reads in missionary newsletters. You cannot write a newsletter with the very mundane, everyday things of life very often. But if you have something spectacular and wonderful to report, then you can always attract attention and you can attract more investment. And so with the stress on the spectacular comes the stress on the short term, on the fast food type of approach to Christian mission. I'm not saying this is all Christian mission is. Of course, I'm painting a very extreme picture of the place where this kind of thinking, taken from the free market...
Don't rubber revolution.
Yeah, okay. So I'd like to finish with two things. The first one is we need to guard our thinking. And the second one is we need to constantly reflect on and re-examine our practice. Because thinking and practice are closely connected. We need to guard our thinking because as Christians we are children of our times. And we are influenced not just by the Bible or Christian tradition, we are inevitably influenced by our culture and that is fine. This is the world in which God has placed us. And as human beings, we are capable of incorporating within our thinking contradictory ideas without even realizing that. So we might be holding on to a cultural construct alongside biblical ideas and values that do not really mesh with one another. And that is why we need to constantly come back to the foundations of our theology and our values. So, is money the root of all evil? Well, if you kind of put it that way, the answer is quite clearly no, because this is such an extreme saying, it can't possibly be true. Money is not the root of all evil. There are all kinds of evil that are rooted elsewhere. And money sometimes can obviously be good. We need money. We need money to buy food. But what I want to suggest is that our instinct, when we hear that saying, or when we come to the radical biblical passages on poverty and riches, our instinct to tame those passages is wrong. And within our current context, the context of free market capitalism, our instinct should be in the opposite direction. When we read 1 Timothy chapter 6 or James or Jesus' words in the gospel, our first task should not be to try and make the rich people in our congregations comfortable by telling them that, of course, money is okay and it's really our attitude towards money. So it's okay for you to drive your Bentleys and go to your expensive holidays. That may be fine, and maybe God doesn't want or does want to give them to give up their Bentleys. We don't know that. But the main point is our instinct should not be first to make those rich people comfortable and then to talk about everything else. Money, or the love of money, is the root of all kinds of evil, should somehow play a much more central role in our theology and in our views on Christian discipleship. We need to be aware much more acutely of the dangerous aspects of the power of money. Because in a new way, the free market has unleashed that power upon us. And it has opened its dangers to us in ways in which in previous eras of human history, this was not maybe necessarily the case. So we need today to focus our thinking a lot more on this and resist all these tendencies that come from the free market, like commodification of human life. We need to be aware of how the free market has corrupted our theology and our way of understanding truth. We need to recover, I would want to suggest, a focus on the mystical aspects of human life and of the Christian experience, of things that cannot be reduced to commodities, things that cannot be quantified, or at least when they are touched by the free market in its desire to quantify them, they pulverize and disappear. Things like love, loyalty, human relationships, and so on. So we need to guard our thinking. That's my first point. And secondly, we need to constantly interrogate our practice, because our practice really flows from our thinking. I've given you one extreme example of how thinking can corrupt practice and can lead to dangerous results. But we constantly need to be thinking, why are we giving money in this way, and what sort of theology and what sort of understanding of the value and power of money underlies all that. And only if we do that, we will be able to swim upstream in a culture where everyone goes in the other direction. Thank you very much.
These labs were never just about listening, but about an engagement. And so I want to encourage you now, in light of what you've just listened to, that you take the questions in the resource pack, questions for you to reflect over, questions for you to discuss further reading, and allow some of this to infiltrate into what you think and what you say. We'd love you to engage further. And also, as you do, please do give us feedback. Fire us an email. We'd love to know how you're finding these labs. Thank you.